Welcome to Life Stories, where we explore the powerful moments that shape our lives. Today, we bring you a story of kindness, dignity, and the surprising twists that change everything. In a high-end restaurant where appearances rule, one waitress defies the norm and shows compassion to a homeless man. Little does she know, this act of kindness will not only turn her world upside down but will also reveal the true power of human connection. Join us as we uncover a tale of unexpected transformations and profound lessons learned. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and begin this journey with us today. In the heart of New York City, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over the streets below, there stood a restaurant called the Empire Grill. It was a place of high-class indulgence, where guests entered the door with polished shoes, expensive perfumes, and a sense of entitlement that could silence even the most modest of voices. Within the grand walls of this restaurant, wealth was not just a status, it was the very air you breathed. The clink of silverware against fine china, the hum of polite conversation, and the faint whispers of secrets shared over expensive wine filled the atmosphere. Yet, as anyone who worked there would know, the beauty of the setting masked an undeniable truth. The Empire Grill was a place where appearances mattered far more than kindness. Among the waitstaff was Emily Harris, a young black woman whose spirit was as strong as the city that surrounded her. At 26, she had already learned that kindness, especially in a place like this, was often a rare commodity. Every day, she navigated the unspoken rules of a world that treated guests like royalty and employees like shadows. Beneath her crisp uniform, she wore the weight of her own struggles, long hours, aching feet, and the harsh reality that life rarely offered second chances to people like her. Emily was no stranger to hardship. Her mother, a woman who had always been her greatest support, was battling a chronic illness that required expensive medication. Emily worked tirelessly, taking shift after shift, barely able to keep up with the mounting medical bills. But no matter how exhausted she felt, she kept going. She had to. It wasn't just for her, it was for her mother, who needed her more than ever. Yet, even with her strength and determination, she could never escape the cold, often indifferent glances of the wealthy customers who dined at the Empire Grill. Then there was Jonathan Blake, the owner of the restaurant, a man whose presence could fill a room, not with warmth but with an aura of cold authority. He was in his 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed. His perfectly tailored suits and slicked back hair gave him the appearance of someone who had it all. But underneath it all was a man who believed in one thing: appearances. Jonathan's world was built on wealth, status, and the illusion of superiority. The staff, to him, were no more than replaceable cogs in a machine. Beneath him, invisible. One evening, as the usual rhythm of the restaurant carried on, the doors swung open, the quiet murmur of conversation faltered for just a moment, and in that brief silence, everyone's eyes turned to see a figure who looked completely out of place. A man in tattered clothes, his hair unkempt, his shoes worn down to nothing, stood in the entrance. His name was James Carter, and to the well-dressed patrons of the Empire Grill, he looked like nothing more than a beggar. The guests' whispers started almost immediately. Some looked away in disgust, while others shot furtive glances toward the staff, waiting for someone to do something, anything, to remove him from the restaurant. Jonathan Blake, standing at the bar, narrowed his eyes. He despised situations like this. A homeless man entering his establishment? It was bad for business. He glanced toward the host stand, expecting someone to act, but to his surprise, no one moved. Then, much to his irritation, Emily Harris stepped forward. With a neutral expression, Emily approached James. There was no hesitation in her voice, no judgment in her eyes. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Empire Grill. Would you like a table for one?" The room seemed to hold its breath. The other staff exchanged surprised glances, their disbelief almost palpable. Jonathan Blake's jaw clenched. This was exactly what he hated about Emily. She was too soft, too willing to offer kindness where it wasn't deserved. But Emily wasn't concerned with Jonathan's opinions. She had seen enough in her life to know that kindness was often overlooked in places like this. But she also knew that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserved respect. James, for his part, seemed surprised, but he didn't flinch. His voice was steady as he replied, "Yes, a table for one would be nice." Emily led him to a small table at the back, away from the VIP section, but not so far as to make it obvious that she was trying to hide him. As she handed him a menu, Jonathan stormed over, his forced smile barely concealing his irritation. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Emily could hear. "We don't serve his kind here." Emily's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. "A paying customer is still a customer, Mr. Blake," she replied calmly. Jonathan scoffed, casting a disdainful glance at James, who was now studying the menu with quiet interest. "Be real, Harris. People like him come here to beg, not to buy. Don't waste my time with this nonsense." Emily met his gaze, her own defiance quiet but firm. "If he orders and pays, he's a customer like anyone else." Jonathan exhaled sharply, clearly aggravated but unwilling to make a scene. "Fine," he spat, "but if he causes trouble, he's your problem." With that, he stormed off, muttering under his breath about wasting time on people who didn't matter. Emily turned back to James, offering him a polite smile. "Can I get you something to drink?" "A glass of water would be nice," James said with a knowing gleam in his eyes. As Emily left to fetch the water, she could feel the stares, silent judgment from the other staff, the whispers behind her back. But she ignored them. This was her job, to serve without bias, without cruelty, and if that made her an outsider in this world of privilege, then so be it. As she returned with his water, James smiled again, this time a little more warmly. "Thank you, Miss Harris. This is the best welcome I've had in a long time." Emily gave a small nod, feeling something inside her stir. She didn't know who this man really was, but something told her that, in that moment, her actions, however small, were making a difference. And for once, in a place that rarely offered kindness, that was enough. The evening continued in its usual cadence, with the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses filling the air. Guests at the Empire Grill sipped their expensive wine, oblivious to the quiet tension between the waitstaff and the man in tattered clothes sitting in the back. James Carter, however, seemed unbothered. He was not fazed by the whispers or the judgmental stares that followed him wherever he went. As he ate, his demeanor remained composed, almost regal in its quiet defiance. Emily watched him from a distance, noticing how he savored each bite of his soup, his eyes closing slightly as if he was not just eating, but truly appreciating the flavors. In contrast, the guests around him rushed through their meals, barely tasting the food in front of them. There was a certain humility in the way James ate that struck Emily. It was a stark reminder of how those with little often learn to appreciate the simplest things, while those with abundance often took such things for granted. But as the night wore on, Emily could feel the undercurrent of unease in the air. Her colleagues, already resentful of her willingness to serve someone they deemed unworthy, were now openly whispering. The judgment was palpable, and she could see the flickers of disdain in their eyes. Despite this, she did her best to remain focused on her job, moving between tables with practiced efficiency. She didn't have time to dwell on the thoughts of others. Her only concern was making sure James was treated with the same respect as any other customer. When she returned to his table to check on him, she noticed the tense look on Jonathan Blake's face as he surveyed the room from across the restaurant. His eyes narrowed as he watched James, and it was clear that he had already formed an opinion about the situation. Emily knew that Jonathan was the type of man who cared deeply about appearances, so much so that he would go to great lengths to maintain the illusion of perfection that his restaurant represented. The last thing he wanted was for the Empire Grill to be associated with anything less than luxury. Emily could see Jonathan making his way toward her, his jaw clenched, his footsteps heavy. She took a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. As he approached, His face twisted into a tight smile. But there was no warmth in it. "How's the situation going, Miss Harris?" he asked. His voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. Emily held her ground. "He's fine, Mr. Blake. A paying customer. Just like anyone else." Jonathan's smile faltered. "You think this is acceptable?" he asked. His voice dropping low. "This man, he's not a customer. He's a nuisance. A distraction. He doesn't belong here. I'm just doing my job," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the tension rising in her chest. "And I don't see why he doesn't belong. He's a paying customer, isn't he?" Jonathan let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "You really think he's going to pay for that meal? You think a man like him has the means to cover a bill here?" His eyes flicked toward James, who was quietly eating his soup, oblivious to the growing storm around him. Emily's heart raced. She had always known that Jonathan had little regard for people like James, people who didn't fit his narrow definition of respectability. But to hear him say it so plainly, to see the disdain in his eyes, made something inside Emily shift. She clenched her fists, but kept her tone calm. "If he orders and pays, he's a customer. That's all that matters." Jonathan's lip curled into a sneer. "Fine," he spat, his frustration evident. "But if he causes trouble, I'm holding you responsible." Emily didn't flinch. She simply nodded, watching as Jonathan stalked off toward the bar, muttering under his breath. As he disappeared into the crowd, Emily turned back to James, who was still calmly eating his meal. His eyes met hers, and she saw something in them, a quiet understanding, a depth that went beyond the surface. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening around him. And yet he chose to remain calm. "Can I get you anything else?" Emily asked, her voice soft. James smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "No, thank you. This is perfect." Emily nodded, returning the smile before walking away. Her heart was heavy, but she felt a small sense of pride. In a world that often seemed to favor the rich and the powerful, she had done what she believed was right. And for once, it felt good to stand firm, even if it meant going against the tide. As the evening continued, the whispers around the restaurant grew louder. The guests were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, their murmurs filling the space like a low hum. But Emily ignored them. She knew what she had to do. And despite the mounting pressure, she refused to let anyone make her feel guilty for showing kindness to someone who needed it. She would continue to serve James with the same respect she gave to any other guest, because, at the end of the day, that's what mattered most. The night at the Empire Grill moved forward with the usual rhythm. The waitstaff slipping between tables with practiced ease, balancing trays of gourmet dishes and wine glasses. But Emily felt an undercurrent of unease she couldn't shake. The tension that had been simmering all evening seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Her boss, Jonathan, had made it clear that he didn't approve of her actions, and the other staff members were far from subtle in their disapproval. The whispers had only grown louder, the judgment more intense, and she could feel the weight of their stares bearing down on her. Yet, in all the noise and discomfort, James remained a calm presence at the back of the room. He continued his meal with the same quiet dignity, savoring every bite of the simple soup and bread Emily had served him. He was no trouble, no nuisance, just a man eating a meal in peace. But as the night wore on, Emily couldn't help but wonder about him. There was something in the way he carried himself, something in his eyes, that suggested he was more than what he seemed. She couldn't quite place it, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. She couldn't have known then, but her instincts were right. James wasn't just a homeless man. He wasn't someone who had wandered into the restaurant on a whim. He was playing a part, and that part was about to change everything. As the evening began to wind down, the last few patrons lingered over their drinks, their conversations quieting as the staff prepared to close up. That's when the door swung open again. The room, already simmering with tension, grew still as everyone turned to look at the figure who had just walked in. This time, it wasn't James in tattered clothes, looking out of place. No, this man was different. He walked in with a quiet confidence, his posture upright, his movements measured. The tattered clothes were gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored suit, dark and elegant, a sleek timepiece glinting from his wrist. His hair, once unkempt, was now styled neatly, and his presence commanded attention the moment he entered. A ripple of recognition spread through the room. Patrons, who had once sneered at him, now whispered among themselves. Some of them leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, exchanging murmurs of surprise. "Wait, that's him. That's James Carter," one of them said, their voice laced with disbelief. "The investor, the one who owns half the city." Emily froze as she saw the transformation before her. The man who had been sitting quietly at the back of the restaurant, ignored and looked down upon, was now someone else entirely. The weight of his true identity began to settle into the atmosphere like a heavy fog. Jonathan Blake, who had been watching the room with his usual smug air, stood still as if someone had just struck him. His face drained of color as he recognized James. For a moment, the grand restaurant seemed to tilt on its axis. The power dynamics that had governed the Empire Grill for years, where wealth was worshipped, and the working class was relegated to invisibility, shifted with the simple entry of a man in a suit. James walked through the room, every step calculated, measured. He moved with purpose, and his gaze locked onto Jonathan's as he approached the bar. Jonathan stood there, paralyzed, unable to move as James stopped right in front of him. His gaze steady, unflinching. There was no malice in James's eyes, only a calm certainty. A quiet power that seemed to emanate from him without effort. "Mr. Blake," James said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Jonathan's mouth opened and closed as if he couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. The same man he had dismissed so easily, the one he had thought was nothing more than a beggar, was now standing before him with the air of someone who owned the very ground they stood on. It was as though the world had tilted, and Jonathan found himself grasping for something to hold onto. Before Jonathan could respond, a woman stepped forward, equally composed, equally confident. Elena Carter, James's sister, was dressed in a sleek black dress that looked effortless in its elegance. Her features were sharp, her posture regal, and there was an undeniable strength in her presence. Emily watched in stunned silence as the two of them stood together, side by side, exuding an aura of power and influence. In that moment, it became clear. James and Elena were not who they had appeared to be. They weren't just survivors of a hard life, they were figures of wealth and influence, with the ability to change everything. Jonathan finally found his voice, though it was tinged with disbelief and desperation. "What is this?" he spat, his face contorting with frustration. "You think you can waltz in here and—" James cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "I'm buying the Empire Grill. Mr. Blake, consider this your notice." The room fell into a heavy silence. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. The restaurant she had worked so hard for, the place that had been her battleground, was now in the hands of someone else, someone who understood the value of people, of kindness, of dignity. As the realization sank in, Emily turned toward James, who caught her gaze for a moment. There was something almost amused in his eyes, something that spoke of a deeper understanding. He had orchestrated this moment, not just to take back control of the Empire Grill, but to remind everyone in that room of one simple truth: appearances could be deceiving, and power didn't always wear a suit. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Jonathan Blake stood frozen, his once commanding presence now dwarfed by the quiet power of James and Elena. The weight of the moment settled over everyone, the reality of what had just occurred sinking in. Jonathan, the man who had once dismissed the value of anyone who didn't meet his standards, now found himself at the mercy of a world he had long tried to control. But James and Elena weren't here to gloat, they were here to bring about change. Emily stood in the background, her heart racing. She had always known there was something different about James, but she had never imagined the depth of his influence. In a world where kindness and empathy were often overlooked, James had shown her that integrity and respect could shift the balance of power. She had been a witness to a moment that would change not just her life, but the future of the Empire Grill. As James turned to leave, his gaze met Emily's once again. This time, it was not just a look of acknowledgement, but of understanding. A silent agreement had passed between them. A belief that kindness, no matter how small, had the power to ripple out and change the world around us. Take care, Emily, James said with a small, knowing smile before walking out the door, Elena following closely behind. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of peace. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that she had made the right choice, to show compassion when the world around her tried to silence it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to stay updated with new life stories.